wait a couple of minutes to let all the participants in, and then we're about to start this webinar. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you all. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. We'll start in a minute. All right. I think we can start. So welcome to everyone who joins this webinar session as part of the OBPS Ocean Best Practices Workshop 2024. We're here today to talk about the ocean governance and how that can enhance best practices. So I'm Laura Meyer. I'll be your moderator for today's session. I'm wearing the hat as the chair of the Ocean Decade Initiative in the IEEE Oceanic Engineering Society today. I'm a lawyer by training and just started working as stakeholder coordination officer at the UN Ocean Decade at IOC UNESCO. So it's a real pleasure to be moderating this webinar among such amazing speakers. And before we dive into the discussion, I would like to introduce our amazing speakers that we have today. I will start with Susana Pereira Valderrama. She has been the marine biologist. She's been the Marine Biodiversity Program Officer at the Secretariat of the Cartagena Convention since June 2023, where she coordinates the implementation of the protocol on specially protected areas and wildlife in the wider Caribbean region. She's a Cuban national with 20 years of experience in national and regional projects to conserve and monitor marine species and ecosystems and design and implement marine protected areas. So she will be speaking about this today as well in the webinar. Then we have Michelle Bender with us. She's a legal counsel at Ocean Vision Legal, an international law firm entirely specializing in marine protection. Michelle created and is the leading expert in the movement towards ocean rights, an ecocentric framework to protect and restore ocean health. She has helped draft rights of nature laws and policy worldwide, including in the United States, Panama, the Philippines, and within international law and institutions. So we're very happy to hear more about that during your presentation. As a third speaker, we have Venkat. He has more than 42 years of experience in ocean technology and served in premier Indian institutions. He has served as consultant to UNESCO IOC GOOS and various other international organizations like UNEP, and is associated with WMO, Ocean CITES, DOOS, OASIS, and OBPS as well. And he's currently also a visiting professor in the Law University. So happy to have you here, Venkat, and looking forward to your presentation. And then we have Craig McLean. He served in NOAA for more than 40 years, attaining the rank of captain in NOAA's Uniform Commission Corps and as a member of the Senior Executive Service. He has worked in marine operations, marine law, and policy leadership positions at, on, and under the sea. So very much looking forward to your insights. The overall objective of today's session is really to explore the role of ocean best practices system in enhancing ocean governance. So to find the connecting link there. And we have several different backgrounds, cultural and also sectoral. So I'm more than excited to dive into the discussion, and we'll give the floor to Craig to start off.
Thank you very much, Laura. And first, I do want to thank all of the organizers here for creating this forum and creating this discussion, because I think if we look across the spectrum of ocean policy, if we look across the spectrum of ocean observations and measurements, we come to realize that it's the lack of a more firm governance platform for us to be working from that has, in some ways, challenged our ability to expand and to gain the richness of observations that we need in order to provide the certainty of what the future is going to look like in the condition of the oceans. So as we move forward here with an ocean best practices undertaking endorsed by the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, the momentum is growing and the needs are apparent and well understood. I think the real challenge for us is how do we choose to implement, how do we choose to define, and how do we choose to affect a rational system of governance beyond where we are right now? Now, there's nothing wrong with where we are right now. We just don't have the completeness of what we need. We've designed the system we have years ago, and we've come a long way. But now that we've learned more about the oceans and we've learned more about the difficulties we're facing, it's time for a refresh on the governance. So, Laura, if I could have my first slide with an apology to everyone. I chose to use cartoons just to be a little lighthearted here and to remind us that I'm responsible for the content of these cartoons. I'll admit to that. And if we look at our world as ocean scientists, as ocean managers, as the people who are trying to take the science that comes from the sea, we are not fully understood by the communities that we serve. We at times can appear to be the zany, brainy scientists. At other times, we have very certain focused comments that we try to offer and hope that people understand the credibility of our voices. Next slide, please. If we look at the global array of ocean measurements and the number and the design of systems, it becomes quite confusing for funding authorities to figure out what should we fund? What is the right tool? What is the right attribute? And if we attach to it a system of governance that could help to guide those investments beyond what right now is a very wide pattern, full of what I like to refer to as jacket patches and t-shirts, the number of observing systems that we have are quite exceptional. I understand that there's a need for people to name their observing system in order to get the unique funding necessary to develop and deploy it. But at the same token, I recall an IOC presentation not too many years ago, and I think our good friend Dr. Jay Perlman was one of the organizers of this particular session. I learned that at the time, there were about 109, 110 ocean observing systems in the scientific literature. I would submit that that's probably 108 or so too many. We need one with local variability to accommodate the difference between, for example, the Mediterranean and perhaps the Arctic Ocean. But to have one system that everyone is contributing to is really where we need to be, and to have a system of governance that gets us there. So if I could have the next slide, please, Laura. As we look then at, take Argo, and I just use Argo as an example, and this poor chap is standing at the side of the road looking to get picked up, and everyone is passing him by. And the little fellow down there says, "Doesn't anyone care?" You have the transportation industry, air, sea, and land. You have the banking and finance and real estate industries, agriculture, aquaculture, and fishing, the telecommunications industry. Everyone is dependent upon the information that we're generating through our systems, plural. I just used Argo as an example. But they don't know that they are the benefactors of these systems. And I think through a more solid system of governance and defining those steps in a best practices regime would be very beneficial and should include an ability to communicate to these industries who generate great financial gain on the information that we're providing, but they don't know where it's coming from. And we need to do a better job of explaining that to these constituencies. Then the next slide, please. If we look at the money that has been developed for space versus the money that's been developed for oceans, there is a huge difference. Yet, while space is nice, and while I have many astronaut friends, and I admire them greatly, and I appreciate their courage and the work that they do. At the same token, if I compare what we've learned from the ocean, including biomedical solutions for diseases that kill people, we've not developed any of those from space. We've not found new species from space. I stare with great wonder at the outer space and the images of the space telescopes that are coming back, and I just ponder the nature of what is infinity. I have a hard time with that. It's easier for me to find intellectual comfort in the knowledge that the explorations and measurements and discovery we've made in the ocean have delivered firm benefits to humanity. And we will continue to do so as we explore, measure, and discover more about the ocean and have a forecast regime that's based on predictable and well-administered ocean observing policies. But right now, the tilt of the scale has, for many countries, certainly the country I hail from, far more money being invested in space and space science than we have being invested in ocean science. That's something that a good system of governance, reaching back into the governments that sponsor our undertaking, could really awaken and transform. So with my last slide, I'll just take a few minutes to go down a hit list. Oh, I'm sorry. This was an Arctic rendering. Yes, please, Laura. Thank you. This was an Arctic rendering to just remind us that we don't have an Arctic goose. We don't have an all-Atlantic goose. We don't have many components that warrant the transition from research deployments to a truly operational oceanography measurement tool. And given that the Arctic, this is a sketch I made up in Greenland, given that the Arctic is the most rapidly changing part of the world, shame on us. We need to go there. We need to get a permanent installed Arctic measurement system. We now have the technology to making such measurements under ice, which for a long time was a barrier. Now, thank you for my last slide. Sorry. Okay, so in understanding the current form of ocean governance, we have the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Within the UN Convention, we have the obligations of state parties to collaborate, to cooperate, to do very much the things we've been doing for years. But if we look objectively, we could find that the Law of the Sea Convention is eroding over time. Number one, there are elements of the convention that should be updated to keep pace with the advent and development of such great technology advances as uncrewed systems. We also have, I've seen countries that are requiring a bond to be posted by chief scientists before allowing the scientific research under Part 11 to be taken up within the exclusive economic zone of such countries. And that is not part of the convention. That is not warranted. It's not deserved. And thankfully, most countries are turning down the opportunity to conduct research in these countries that do that. And the other one I'll mention is the 9-dash line that China has put forward, which is in violation of the convention. It has been adjudicated to be in violation of the convention, but we have a convention that really has no teeth in order to do anything about it. So the UN convention is generally an admonition, even though it's a treaty obligation for most laws. Embedded in the convention are the principles that the IOC, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, a subordinate body under the Law of the Sea within UNESCO, part of the UN family, has developed. A concern I have there, and please understand my desire in this panel is to be a bit provocative rather than plain speaking, that I see a remarkable usurpation of what is statutorily created under UNESCO and the IOC statutes of functional autonomy. UNESCO, where there is no ocean expertise, is trying to basically usurp and take over the IOC, where all the ocean expertise is concentrated. And I think that's something that should anger, if not enrage, some of the delegations to UNESCO. The IOC has for decades focused that expertise. Only recently has UNESCO woken up to the reality that oceans are popular, and they're trying to rebrand themselves with oceans, whereas for decades, IOC has been long ignored. Leave the expertise where it is, award the functional autonomy of the IOC to itself so that the IOC can run in what is really 150 nations. It's a scientific forum. It is not a political forum. I was the US representative to the IOC for 11 years. You may know the dynamics between the United States government and countries like Iran and and Cuba. I supported, with the assent of my nation, initiatives by Iran, initiatives by Cuba, initiatives by other countries that you might normally associate United States affinity with. So it's an apolitical forum. If it makes sense scientifically, the IOC does it and can do it. But the challenge we have in the IOC with ocean observing and ocean measurements is that it's a voluntary compliance scheme. It is a coalition of the willing rather than a compulsion. And if we compare that to the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, which is a treaty-based organization, there are obligations under WMO to report weather-based observations. And that becomes really challenging for us. So within the IOC, within the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, following the guidelines that are set out in the Law of the Sea Treaty, we have developed over years the Global Ocean Observing System. And the GOOS that is referred to in shorthand, and I'm sure that many of the people here are most familiar with it, so I'll not spend much time on it. But I raised the question whether our delegations to the IOC are sufficiently focused on this very important observing system, and whether the delegations themselves are as loyal to the importance of the global observing system as the people who are running it happen to be. And after watching for 11 years, I'm not convinced that that level of importance is understood at home in each of the delegations. Some very well, but others not. And I think that's some work that we have to do to make sure that we are communicating to the delegates to the IOC the importance of the global ocean observing system. Now, one of the complexities that we have to face is the release and availability of ocean measurements taken within the exclusive economic zone of a member state. And in many cases, national security issues complicate, if not prevent, the release of observations made within these exclusive economic zones. The trouble for that is, unless you have the whole ocean, models will not function at their ultimate level of skill. So when we start to develop notions of building computer models that duplicate the behavior of the ocean, we have to make sure that we're not getting a cartoon caricature of the ocean, but instead we're getting the true duplicated nature of what the ocean behavior will be. But without EEZ information, that's going to be very hard to do. Funding is mixed within our global ocean observing community. And this is where I really hope and think that ocean best practices can have some help here. Some countries, by necessity, are choosing to fund ocean observation systems through research. But a research project, by definition, is typically of finite duration. It is not indefinite. And we don't forecast weather in many countries based on research projects. We focus and forecast based on steady state operational observations that are made. We need to do the same thing in the ocean. So while some countries are, by necessity, as I say, funding through research budgets, some are funding through meteorology budgets, and some have really moved on to become operational oceanography centers and installations. Mercator, for example, in Europe, has done that quite well within the EU. So we need to be looking at how do we structure, how do we fund, and is there a requirement for an obligation to submit your measurements? So lastly, I'll just make reference back to my observation of too many systems by label. Even though we're all contributing to one grand global ocean observing system, we have too many distracting names. So I think for best practices, coming up with a notion of how you incorporate within something bigger than one's own observing system to make it a global observing system, how we look at the funding structure so that we could migrate from research into operations and make that transition, and also just have a greater focus on this global ocean observing system within the delegations of the international bodies that support it, and make sure that the importance of oceans is not subsumed by something higher simply because it's a season of style to be focusing on oceans. Everyone on this call has been doing it for their career. It's not a jealousy perspective, it's a competency perspective. Raise it too high and you lose the expertise. So with that, I look forward to the ocean best practices activity, really bringing some clarity to this. And I would say that maybe a handful of us can get together and write a draft that encourages an addendum to the Law of the Sea Treaty, just as we've had for BBNJ, biological diversity beyond national jurisdiction. It's attendant to the auspices of the UN Treaty on Law of the Sea, comports with it, and it defines new obligations. Might we do something similar to create an obligation for ocean measurements being submitted and shared throughout all the nations of the world? Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel.
Thank you very much, Craig, especially for the cartoons. I think they say more than 1,000 words, as you so nicely say. And also for highlighting some flaws and really trying to highlight the critique as well. And I would just like to encourage all of the participants to drop their comments and questions in the Q&A box, as after all of the presentations, we have allocated significant time to dive into the discussion. So thank you so much, Craig. And I will hand over to Venkat, who will highlight the ocean best practices.
Thank you, Laura. I'm audible. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you for organizing this session. Thanks to Craig for giving a starting platform for me to proceed. We have gathered here with a group of scientists working in ocean science and the lawyers. There is a unique community we are joined together. So my job is today to give us a brief introduction about ocean best practice and to proceed what we need to do about the policy as a group. Next slide. So this is known that ocean best practice is backed by UNESCO, UOC, and IOD through and GOOS, and it provides publication and discovery and access relevant information and methods in observation and application. From 2018 to till date, I've been closely associated, and thanks to Jay and team, and it has grown to that level of 2,216 documents, and we have 6 terminologies, and we have more publications, and we have capacity building exercise, and the publications have gone more than 60,000 views. So that is what is a growth, that is what is an importance. We know very well about ocean best practice. Next slide. Before I proceed, for some of you lawyers, I thought, what is this ocean best practice? We know very well the practice. We know the importance of best practice and standards, because that is what gives an uniformity when you talk about the methodology, when you talk about standards, and that provides a set of rules that can be followed globally, so that whatever the decisions, whatever the results, what we are talking about, it becomes common for all. So the future of ocean research and the operations and application methods are agreed universally. That's what I meant. Next slide. So the neat part is this: there is a common method we call FAIR, that is interoperability and reproducibility. What we measure today, what data sets we have, that should be applicable, that should be used by others, particularly for modeling aspect, to give a common result that should be used, because today the society needs such information. So this need aspect is well understood. Next slide. But Ocean Best Practice provides wonderful support and entered best practices and provides a complete value chain for the entire ocean community. You can see the repository, and you can also visualize the publications from the journals and the training academy ocean teacher, which provides a capacity building exercise. So like these workshops, annual workshops provide us information like us. A newer community gets formed and discuss in a newer area avenues where we can proceed further. As Craig has rightly pointed out, we have standards and we have guidelines in WMO. Ocean best practices followed in ocean community, both biology, chemical. We have EOVs, and all these EOVs are linked to ocean best practice. Next slide. So coming back to that, we know about the complete value chain, which is a basis of the foundation, and all these things required observation, analysis, and data management and effective implementation. Every one of the next, keep clicking. Every one of these aspects require the ocean best practice. We have seen the importance, how this is linked, in particular how the information reaching the society, particularly the coastal hazards and climate change, and all these aspects, we look at it in a broader perspective. So addressing the value chain is a main component of ocean best practice. Coming back to next slide, coming back to Goose, I thought I will give an introduction because I had a brief association working with Goose. We need to talk about ocean science and services. We know the challenges what the humanity faces, how the ocean is getting polluted and what changes it is happening, and how the climate change is affecting all of us, how the natural system can, how much it can hold, how long we can do, how this ocean sustainability can proceed. All these things require the sustained observation. That's what Goose talks about that. And we have seen the importance of different countries today, where we have GOOS today has got 84 countries working together. And during my association last year, we need to bring about the national focal point from various countries, and we could succeed in bringing about 77 countries. That's growing now. I'm sure that we will have a larger community working together globally for a common cause. That is what a GOOS is looking in expanding the gap areas to provide this information and real-time data sets that can be shared. Next slide. So when you talk about policy, how that can be linked to ocean best practice, keep clicking. So I thought I can broadly divide that into adaptive and holistic ocean management, wherein we know very well the ocean nature is dynamic, and we need to look at whole thing need to be changing and adaptive. And we have seen it cannot be static approach, and the management approach requires a dynamic nature. Then global communication and data sharing, which you and Ocean Brigade is really talking about the digital representation of the ocean that requires ocean best practice for the data sharing part. And rights of nature, this really talked about few countries have understood the importance of recognizing the rights of the nature, and they got definite laws have been evolved that need to be looked at it. And if these countries have succeeded, why not that can be expanded? This group can think about that, and that can work on it and enable reflective practices. That's what ocean best practices can really help. We need to look at it reflective method, where the scientific tools and methods can help you, and that will have in the larger level the diversity way of producing the results. Next slide. So this is the last one to talk about that. We need the policy decision. The policymakers would like to have a scientific component when you look at it, because the scientific results will not tell you how much money to be invested in that. It gives the overall what is a projected level. Whereas the stark difference between lawyers, they proceed and they need to make it in the sense that they have to work out the solving the problems. Now we are here to look at how the sound decision making, both lawyers and scientists can work together, use these scientific tools to help in the decision-making process. Herein, the importance of ocean best practices need to be understood. That's an ideal tool to share the knowledge and the survey experience, what we have gathered in both lawyers and scientists part of it. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to share this experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Venkat, for highlighting the role of best practices and also the science policy interface, right? That we need to translate our knowledge into the right language so scientists can understand the policymakers and lawyers and vice versa. So thank you very much. And I'm very happy to hand over the microphone to Susana Pereira Valderrama, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity to be here sharing our experiences from the Cartagena Convention Secretariat. And next slide, please. I'm just going to comment on the role of the Cartagena Convention, and in particular the specially protected areas and wildlife protocol in enhancing ocean governance through the sharing of best practices. Next slide, please. So as my colleagues have previously commented, ocean governance refers to the, and we all of course are aware, refers to the management and regulations of the oceans and their resources, and of course is directed to ensure sustainable use and marine conservation. So that's the main role of the Cartagena Convention and its protocols. And as we are also aware, it involves multiple stakeholders, including the governments, international organizations, regional organizations, the civil society, the private sector, the academia, a wide array of stakeholders. And of course, implementing best practices is essential to promote ocean governance, a proper ocean governance. Next slide, please. So I wanted to commend the relevance of the Caribbean region for how relevant is the ocean governance for a very diverse region, politically, culturally, and biologically diverse, with a wide range of governance systems, cultures, and of course biodiversity, including all three levels. gens, species, and ecosystems. And of course, the relevance of the marine biodiversity for sustaining local economies, a lot of them highly dependent on activities like tourism and fisheries, in particular in small island developing states, which are also one of the most impacted by the significant threats that the region faces, including marine pollution, habitat degradation, and of course the impacts of the climate change. And for this, regional cooperation is essential, no? And that's why we are trying our best to do with the legal framework that the Cartagena Convention has. Next, please. So the Regional Seas Convention and Action Plan is one of the oldest programs of the United Nations Environment Program. It was created in 1974. Actually, this year was its 50th anniversary, and there are these 18 programs all over the world. And the Cartagena Convention is the legal framework to implement the Caribbean Environment Program in the wider Caribbean region. And next, please. The Cartagena Convention was adopted in 1983 and entered into force in 1986 at the same time that the first protocol, the protocol concerning to the cooperation in combating oil spills. And so far, the convention has 26 contracting parties of the 28 countries in the Caribbean, including all the continental countries in the region, starting from to the north from with the United States until French Guiana, and all the islands, the Antilles in the wider Caribbean region. It also has, well, as I mentioned, it has 3 protocols: the oil spill protocol was the first adopted, and then the specially protected areas and wildlife protocol, and the protocol concerning land-based sources from marine pollution. The Cartagena Convention, it is a legally binding agreement, so the countries that are parties to the convention and its protocols has obligations to comply with what is established in the convention and its protocols. And the Secretariat, UNEP has provided Secretariat to the Cartagena Convention and is based in Kingston, Jamaica. And we also support, also the 3 protocols are supported by regional activity centers. So, for example, the SPO protocol, Specially Protected Areas and Wildlife, has the SPO Regional Activity Center that is funded by the government of France and is based in the island of Guadeloupe. So as you can imagine, we have Spanish-speaking countries, English-speaking countries, French, and those territories. So a wide cultural spectrum of countries and cultures. Next, please. So the SPO protocol, these are the main objectives of the SPO protocol, and it's mainly related to increase the number of marine protected areas and, of course, improve the management of these, and support the conservation of endangered species and promote the sustainable use of these. And for this, the SPO protocol has 3 annexes, including species of plants and animals to be fully protected. So the countries that have ratified the protocol have the obligations to protect these species, and also has Annex 3 with certain species also endangered, but that can be sustainable use. So, for example, management plans are needed to build, etc. And of course, the SPO protocol, one of the objectives very relevant is to develop strong regional capability, capacity building, training, etc., among all the contracting parties, and cooperate with other relevant multilateral environmental agreements. And I wanted in this case to highlight the collaboration that we are promoting with global agreements like CITES, like the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in this sense, I also want to comment that the objectives of the whole protocol are very well aligned with several of the targets of the Kumen-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So yes, we're promoting the cooperation with it. Next, please. Next, thank you. So yes, I don't have much time, so let me go fast. What is the relevance of implementing and promoting best practices of the first, we need to strengthen regional governance by providing common guidelines and a framework. And I'm going to use the example of the SPO working groups. We need to build capacity as was established in the objectives of the SPO protocol. And also very relevant is to enhance the adaptation for the impacts of the climate change. Next, also, oh, sorry, I'm not seeing properly. Yes, as one other of the objectives of the SPO protocol is to strengthen marine protected areas. We also need to adopt, establish, and enhance marine protected areas with international standards. We have the categories, we have the management guidelines, so this is promoted also. Promote also integrated, sorry, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So also promoting the collaboration for share resources and strengthen the implementation of common policies and engage multiple stakeholders, including fisheries, tourism, etc. Let me go fast. Please, next. Yeah, also promoting regional collaboration, and as my colleagues were explaining, it's important to support scientific research to better understand the marine ecosystems and the threats facing by this, and encourage, of course, innovative solutions for habitat restoration, pollution. And a good example is the regional collaboration on dealing with the sargassum inundation issue in the wider Caribbean region. And finally, next please. I wanted to quickly comment on the role of the SPO working group. There are 4 SPO working groups, group of experts. We have the Marine Protected Areas group, the Species working group, the Exemptions working group, and the sargassum working groups. And these groups are integrated by representatives, experts designated by each contracting party, as well as observers organizations to the Cartagena Convention, including specialists from the academia, universities, and regional organizations with relevant expertise in marine conservation. And this group provide technical and scientific to marine conservation, protected areas, and the topics of the working group. As you can imagine, it's a broad spectrum of cultural backgrounds and perspectives.
I think we lost Susanna for a bit. I don't know if I'm the only one. Here she is
Sorry,
again.
it seems like
Yeah.
I lost connection. I'm back.
No problem. We can hear you again.
And can see me? Give me
Yes.
1 second. Okay, so as I was saying, I'm not sure what was the last part you heard, but the working groups meet periodically to analyze emerging needs and the challenges. Of course, the contracting parties dictates what the working groups need to do. and the working groups identify the strategic priorities for the work plan, and this can include, for example, establishing new marine protected areas or include new marine protected areas in the SPO list of protected areas, etc. So several topics are analyzed in this working group. Next, please. And then we have the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. This is a group of experts from all the contracting parties, and then this framework is responsible for reviewing the working group's recommendations, the best practices that the working group promote, and then the priorities are again analyzed, but always considering the recommendations from the working group. And then the Conference of Parties of the Cartagena Convention will, with all the countries, with all the focal points, are the responsible for approve or not the recommendations for the working groups. I wanted to remind that the COP decisions are binding, so the countries have the obligations to commit these decisions. And of course, the main role of the working group is ensure that these decisions are based on scientific consensus, scientific knowledge, and regional needs. Next, please. So to finalize, yes, comment you on the inclusive and science-based nature of the working groups and all the process of and all the importance of the Cartagena Convention and the SPO protocol for the conservation and sustainable use of the marine biodiversity, and for sharing best practices among all the Caribbean countries with a holistic approach to the conservation, and it's a call to strengthen capacity and regional collaboration to the promotion of best practices. With we have the objective on promote capacity building and strengthening neighbors and adopting adaptive management practices. Next, please. I think that's the last one. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry for taking just a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susanna. I think just zooming in on one region makes the complexity already very clear, how many different stakeholders are involved to creating an ocean governance framework. So I think this was a very good presentation to show how complex it is. So everyone who has questions, I already see some in the Q&A, keep populating it. And if it's regular, if it's for a specific person, please indicate that, and otherwise I will just read them out afterwards. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Michelle to hear some other perspectives and future opportunities. So please, Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. And you could go ahead and start on the first slide. That's fine, thanks. So as we heard from Venkat, Rights of Nature is an emerging framework that can enhance ocean governance. I have been working in this space for about 9 years now. So my goal is to introduce more on what it is, where it's happening, and specifically how it can do so. So to start, the Rights of Nature framework evolves from 3 main ethical principles: that of moral consideration, intrinsic values, and interconnectedness. So first, Thomas Berry and his 10 principles of Earth jurisprudence introduced that rights originate where existence originates. Therefore, the assumption is that all life has rights merely for existing, and therefore all ecosystems and species are worthy of moral consideration. This is important because rights, in many ways, is Western legal system's most powerful moral and legal concept, where the level of protection an entity has, whether it's humans, corporations, animals, in many instances, this is directly related to the legal rights that are held. Then we have the principle of intrinsic values, which states that all life has intrinsic worth regardless of its utility or direct benefit to society. So regardless of the perceived economic value, all life is worthy of protection. And thirdly, the principle of interconnectedness, that we are not separate from nature, but we're a part of nature, that human health, livelihood, and rights are dependent upon and interconnected with the health of the environment. So therefore, we must respect this relationship in order to use nature now into the future. You could go ahead, next slide, please. So this brings us to ocean rights, which is the application of the rights of nature framework within ocean law and policy, and the concept that I created in 2017 to do so. Ocean rights is the ethical and moral recognition of the ocean as a living entity with inherent rights and intrinsic values. And it therefore seeks to shift the human-ocean relationship from one of separateness and exploitation to one of partnership and stewardship. Next slide, please. The great thing is this movement is happening. Over 300 rights of nature laws, policies, and judicial decisions exist in almost 40 countries. Though it's still in its infancy for implementation and enforcement in many jurisdictions and in ocean law and policy, we are seeing examples emerge worldwide, specifically applying this framework to marine ecosystems and species. Aruba is proposing to explicitly recognize their marine waters as having inherent rights within their rights of nature constitutional amendment that was proposed last year. In Panama, a national sea turtle conservation law recognized sea turtles as subject of rights. And most recently, a national refuge was just proposed and approved that incorporates rights of nature principles. Also last year, though this law has since been reversed, for lack of local authority, the Loyalty Islands province of New Caledonia amended its provincial code to recognize sharks and sea turtles as natural entities with the right to a healthy and safe environment. We also have waves. The wave ecosystem at the mouth of the Rio Doce River in Brazil was most recently recognized as having inherent rights. In Ecuador, rights of nature is recognized in its constitution, but also as a guiding principle for the special law of the Galapagos. And there have been multiple court cases that have invoked rights of nature, including one specific to illegal shark fishing in the Galapagos. We're also starting to see rights of nature at the international law level and institutional level, including in the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 framework and the recent UN Ocean Decade Venice Declaration for Ocean Literacy Action. And finally, two initiatives worth mentioning, though these are not binding laws or by any means yet. One to recognize whale personhood in the Pacific, and another to work towards a universal declaration of ocean rights, are emerging to bring this framework to the regional and international levels. Next slide, please. So the question remains, what do these laws change? And there's a lot that we could dig into, but I just wanted to provide a small snapshot and just speak to three examples. So first, the underpinning ethics and norms of most Western environmental, legal, and governance frameworks are largely derived from an anthropocentric ethic, an ethic that views the ocean as a resource, property, free for all. We see this in UNCLOS with the prevailing norm of freedom of the high seas. These ethics are indirect drivers of policy decisions and economic activity. They influence how we conduct ourselves in the marine environment. And so they're just as important for us to address as direct drivers, such as the regulation of human use. In contrast, ocean rights creates an ecocentric or oceanic ethic, where the plurality of values that exist, including the intrinsic values of the ocean itself and cultural values, are to be balanced in decision-making and disputes alongside the prevalent human interests. So this allows us to pull away from decision-making where human interests tend to outweigh ecological interests, even with laws and regulations designed to do the opposite. And specifically, the respect for the intrinsic values of nature of the ocean requires further changes in decision-making, such as the strict adherence to the precautionary principle. Unfortunately, the best available science, for example, showing what levels of fishing would be sustainable, is oftentimes ignored. In fact, a study found that the adherence to the best available science is only binding in 26% of countries. In contrast, under rights and nature frameworks, we're seeing that adherence to the best available science is binding. So it is a legal obligation. And this also requires that there's diverse views of what science is, not only Western science, but indigenous and traditional knowledge is included as the best available science. And a final point, though, like I said, there's a lot more we could dig into, is this intersection of science and policy. The policy objectives that are ultimately framed by science and societal values. We need a reframing of these objectives and standards. For example, the vision for the UN Ocean Decade is the science we need for the ocean we want. And the Ocean Health Index definition of a healthy ocean is one that delivers a range of benefits to people now into the future. So you could see how these policy objectives are inherently anthropocentric and focus on what we need, what we determine is healthy or sustainable. In contrast, ocean rights calls us to look at the science the ocean needs. What is ecologically sustainable? Instead of asking ourselves, what is the most we can take out of the system without collapse? How can we instead ensure populations and ecosystems are maintained and thriving and flourishing? Instead of determining metrics for health based upon our needs, what about the metrics specific to the maintenance of ecosystem integrity, functionality, the maintenance of the oceanic cycles? Next slide, please. Now, there's still much work to do in terms of ensuring rights of nature laws have effect, but one way that is emerging to ensure that these frameworks are implemented in force is through guardianship models, which I think offers an amazing best practice for ocean governance going forward. So these governance or institutional reform mechanisms through guardianship, they can provide proactive mechanisms to protect the interests and intrinsic values of the ocean in decision-making affecting its health. In many instances, this requires creating a new management body or governance structure with appointed individuals who have a legal responsibility to uphold and act on behalf of the ecosystem, nature, species, and in our instance, it would be the ocean. In New Zealand, Aotearoa, the Te Awa Tupua Act in 2017 specifically created a guardianship structure comprised of two people, one from the local Maori with an iwi with interest in the river, and one nominated on behalf of the Crown. But both, regardless of their background, have an explicit responsibility to uphold the rights and the values of the river. On the other hand, in Colombia in 2016, a judicial decision declared that the Atrato River is a legal entity subject of rights. This structure was therefore created after the declaration of legal personhood by the court. So this has and it continues to take a few years on negotiations to establish. The guardianship body for the Atrato River consists of a much larger group, inclusive of folks from the Ministry of the Environment and a collegial body that is comprised of 7 male and 7 female representatives from the communities surrounding the Atrato region. And then a final example, in New Caledonia, they sought to create this structure still with equal representation from the government and indigenous groups, but with one person from each of the 3 customary areas of the Loyalty Island province. So you can see how, it's not one size fits all approach, and it's very much dependent on the context, but these are some of the examples that are emerging specific to guardianship. And next slide, please. And here I just wanted to share some of the provisions of the Te Awa Tupua Act so you can see it specifically. And it's also just some beautiful writing, in my opinion. So the act created formal guardians, or Te Pou Tupua, and these humans are obligated to act and speak for and on behalf of the river. Their functions include upholding the river's intrinsic values, promoting and protecting the river's health and well-being, and administering the fund that was set up or is set up to support the river's health. Te Pou Tupua, in performing its functions, must act in the interests of Te Awatupua, or the river, and consistently with the river's intrinsic values. So this act, as you can see, it also allows the new management board, Te Awatupua, to participate in any statutory process affecting the river's health. Next slide, please. So the benefits of guardianship include increased environmental protection, but also increased participation of local communities and the uplifting of Indigenous values and rights in the instances where the Indigenous communities are represented. Additionally, for both the Atracha River and the Wanganui River, Te Awatupua, an important aspect is really this bipartisan nature of the guardianship body. So we have both government and affected communities, which are having dialogue with one another. So this is really facilitating that dialogue between both sides as well. However, of course, there are challenges, some considerations to be taken into account. Questions arise, who's qualified to represent these ecosystems or the ocean? What skills do they need? What number of representatives are inclusive enough? Are there resources available? Ultimately, the success of these guardianship bodies and their implementation will be, do they have the resources to perform their functions adequately? So there's more to be taken into account, but these are, three of the main questions that are emerging as we're seeing different initiatives develop this approach. But despite these challenges, I really see immense potential, for example, in reforming existing management bodies that surround ocean governance, such as fishery management councils, RFMOs. Can we do some sort of reform to ensure that these bodies have representatives or have a duty to ensure that the needs of the ecosystems or the specific species populations are taken into account when we're deciding, decisions like quota allocations? This is something we've been pushing for example, in the Pacific Northwest with the southern resident orcas, who are listed as endangered, going quite extinct, possibly in the next few years, by ensuring that fishery management councils are ensuring their basic survival needs for salmon in these decisions that are happening every year as well. So I see immense potential, a lot of work to do in terms of what this means in practice, implementation, and enforcement still. But with that, I will leave it to Q&A. And the final slide is just my email if anyone has questions.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think you made it very clear that it really starts with the shift of the mindset and the way how we relate to the ocean. So this was a very insightful presentation. I now invite everyone to ask questions. I have a few in the Q&A box, so I will start with that, but don't be shy and use the time. We have about half an hour left to dive into the discussion. So feel free to ask any question to any panelists. So if you want to put your camera on, I will read out the first question, which says the following. What is stopping the industries benefiting from publicly funded ocean research from privatizing the data gathering, keeping it from the public? Maybe that's more related to Craig, who started about the different data. Maybe you want to respond to that first, but then everyone, please speak if you want to.
Laura, thank you. And thank you to the person who asked that question. I think I first have to start with praising some of the components of industry like Fugro, for example, where a private company is collecting ocean information and making it freely available to the international ocean databases, plural, whether it's Seabed 2030 or whether it's the Global Ocean Database. Philanthropies are doing the same thing, but of course, a philanthropic approach is for the greater welfare of the world. Typically, a commercial approach is to try and generate or if not maximize profit. So I applaud commercial companies that are doing this. I also think Caledon and Victor Vescovo has done a very positive job of that as well. So what is holding companies back? I think, number one, mostly governments are currently funding, and they're in the pattern of funding the acquisition of these observations and measurements. And governments would have to then transfer their funding patterns to commercial sector in order to fund a commercial sector to do this work. And when governments are used to performing their work, they're usually not looking for a new model. You just get in the habit of doing business the way you've been doing it. I think the United States experienced a great breakout of that model when we decided that we would fund 50% of ocean mapping by the commercial sector, the other 50% by government. The model is something that needs to be worked out. I think weather is one of those considerations. Ocean measurements, one of those considerations. Ocean mapping, one of those considerations. For ocean mapping, it has been worked out. It costs the government the same amount with a modest percentage profit for the contractor. For satellite acquisition, weather acquisition, the companies that are collecting this information are looking to sell to each user what that information is. And that then becomes financially imponderable in order to pay for that information each time. If you're going to develop a government model that says, under the WMO, we'll buy it and we'll share it with everyone. So these proprietary agreements have to be further refined. So it's a business model. That business model has not yet been fully optimized. And I think we all have to have an open mind for what could be a better acquisition of information than the singular paths that we're on now.
Thank you. Yeah, if anyone has any ideas, I think you can contact all of us as well to optimize the way that we're working at the moment. So yeah, thank you so much for explaining. Does anyone else want to respond to this question? Otherwise, I will continue with the next one, which comes from Frank Miller-Carger, also for Craig. Thank you for an excellent and forward-looking presentation. Could you lay out a straw roadmap to accomplish what you proposed in your closing comments? Let's do it.
I'm sorry, that was back to me, Laura? Okay, well, how do we lay it out? Yeah, how do we lay it out in a closing comment? I'm going to look to Michelle and the wisdom and tenacity, very polite tenacity, that Michelle has shown in order to keep advancing something that was very foreign to most people in the ocean community for quite some time. And the progress that Michelle and her garnered colleagues have rendered to be putting ocean rights into a portion of the UN General Assembly this past year has been phenomenal. So what it proves to me is that if you start talking about something that has logic to it, you will find people joining and signing on. And the numbers that are growing for ocean rights is impressive, and it's happened quickly. If we were to take something that is probably less, what should I say, less unique in its outlook, and Michelle, no insult, right? There's nothing unique about understanding the rights of an entity. That is humanity, we do that, I get it. But if we take a look at something like, should we be required to be depositing our ocean measurements into an international forum? Not just if we feel like it, wouldn't it be nice? But because ocean forecasts are becoming as necessary and valuable as weather forecasts, why should we not be requiring the submission of that which is measured? And to be able to proffer that in a productive way, Michelle has shown us in something that is less practically obvious to most people, and to be doing it in something that could be more described as a parallel to a weather forecast. Why not be doing this? Right? It's a greater leap for ocean rights than it is for a good ocean forecast. So I think we should start writing literature, publishing a paper or two that then delegations at the IOC or at the UN General Assembly could walk around and point to, because Michelle has authored a number of papers and scholarly works in order to push this forward, and colleagues as well. So I think we just need to get active with this and say the current method that we're operating under is not getting it done. The other aspect is WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. It's a fine organization for meteorology. If the WMO absorbs ocean observations, I think we still need to close another generation of training where meteorologists understand oceanography. It took a long time. 2 generations ago, a meteorologist didn't know what an oceanography was. Who's an oceanographer? What is oceanography? We didn't even find meteorologists accepting that upper ocean heat, not just sea surface temperature, was a forecaster of tropical cyclone intensity. It took decades to get that. Right now, if we surrender ocean observations either to UNESCO, my former points where it's too elevated authority to really have the experts, or the WMO, I admire WMO, I credit WMO for their good work, but the culture of meteorology is not yet tuned to the subtleties of oceanography. So that's why I would rather keep in IOC, strengthen IOC, and get an addendum to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, parallel to BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, that warrants the submission. And then we could have the discussion, what that would submit. How detailed do we get in what that information is? That's a pathway for us to go.
Thank you very much. I think it's a clear call to action that we have to start working. But I want to give the floor to Michelle if you want to respond to something that Craig said, since he mentioned you.
Well, I was just going to add on in terms of the messaging. I think how you go about messaging is incredibly important. Because just speaking from experience, coming from, a very small rights of nature bubble, if you're just talking amongst yourself, amongst the experts in your own space, you tend to have different ways of messaging and communicating because you already believe in the message. But then convincing others, you need to adjust that messaging in many instances. And so what we've learned, especially with the effort for a universal declaration of ocean rights, is we have to approach this in a non-adversarial way. Many messages that come with rights of nature specifically, really hone in on the fact that environmental law isn't working, these efforts aren't working. But if you come, and put yourself in the shoe of a policymaker, of someone who's working in the space, doing great work, making these great advancements, that does not sound welcoming to them to want to join the movement, because then that's of course adversarial language. So, I think it's really important to recognize the spaces you usually speak in, whether it's like scientist to scientist, policy, law. And then when you're trying to get these messages out to different groups, is you do have to work on what that messaging, how that messaging can shift to different stakeholders to really pose this as an opportunity to work together, to coordinate a win-win for all, rather than, pointing out the negatives and why we need to change. I think that's been a really big learning, lesson for us in the movement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle. I think that kind of leads directly to the next question. And I think either you or Venkat, who talked about best practices more in general, can respond to this. What kind of methods or best practices are needed to evolve these kind of new governances or governance structures?
It's a very good...
Yeah, Venkat, sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was just asking, where's that question at so I can read it?
I think it's in the private chat to me, but it says, do we also address the methods or best practices needed to evolve the governance?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm very glad to hear that somebody is interested to put this in a best practice method. So what you need to do is that whatever you're doing, how best it can be fine-tuned and make it as a practice that can be submitted. You can even communicate to us directly. And the website also clearly provides that how best this can be, either as an individual or a community, whatever information you have that can be given to the repository in a peer-reviewed manner. So please contact us. We will take care and try to document whatever information you got, and we are here to support you. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it's either in the chat box or in the Q&A. So I'll try to read both. I'll go back to the Q&A, which is the next one. The Atlas Network and its affiliates, like the Heritage Foundation, promote elimination of government regulatory bodies via regulatory capture or defunding and discrediting them via merchants of doubt. Argentina's current leader, one of the Atlas affiliates, has done or is doing that as we speak. What protections can be envisioned to protect regulators, science, and scientists from worst practice and reorient them into best practices? I don't know who feels most comfortable in responding to this question first. Do you want to start, maybe Susanna, since it's more in the region? I know Argentina is not in the Caribbean, but do you want to add something?
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to understand the Atlas network and its affiliates. The question is if the government regulatory capture the fund. Well, I will say, like, in the framework of the Cartagena Convention, we follow the decisions presented by the contracting parties. So if there is a consensus on promoting such an initiative, well, we definitely would be pleased to follow with this. But as I was saying, we need, for example, a consensus. And in the case of Argentina, it's not in the Cartagena Convention, but they are, for example, in the Permanent Commission for the South Pacific. So a regional approach can be framed in this commission. So this is something that you can try there. I'm not sure if I'm responding, but yes. Do you want
anyone else wants
Yeah.
to add something to the question or comment? Otherwise, I'll go on to the next one. Regarding rights of nature, one of the tenets of human rights is the right to vote. If nature cannot vote, then its interests will not be represented. Is there a way for nature to vote? Maybe
So-
Michelle.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, and this is also related to one of the biggest challenges question, is it's important not to conflate nature's rights with human rights. This is actually a big gap in messaging and communications in the movement that we're working to address. Because a legal person, a legal entity's rights and duties are unique to its existence. For example, corporations don't have the same rights as humans. Right? Because the entity it's different and unique. It has different duties as well. And so humans have human rights, rivers have river rights, and the ocean has ocean rights. So that's one of the big messages we're trying to make clear. But I would say that in terms of this aspect of representation, we're seeing this emerge, for example, in legal standing. So allowing any citizen or specific representatives to represent the ecosystem in decisions and disputes. And so, for example, in Ecuador, in their constitutional amendment, they make it so any citizen, any person, any entity can bring a lawsuit on behalf of nature. And then we're also seeing those guardianship models emerge where the ecosystem or nature, the species, then is represented by someone that has that legal responsibility. And we're also seeing different ideas and mechanisms emerge, though I would say these are not fully vetted yet. I think there's still a lot of gaps in these, such as, board representation for nature, like nature on the board, and ideas like that. I think there's still, those are emerging already, but there's definitely a gap in how those board members ensure they do that. Instead of just giving a voice for nature, it's like, what are these then responsibilities and standards in place for these board members to then have a vote for nature and ensure that that vote is for nature. So still a lot of work to do on that, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll read out the next question by Oliver Wilson. In terms of long-term funding for a rights-based nature approach, do you see value in an opportunity to establish a beneficiary-based funding model? For example, if a restoration site / MPA create spillover, could you see fisheries, commercial or recreational, playing a beneficiary fee or user pay approach to support ongoing management? Maybe
I guess.
Susanna, you want to go first, or
Yes.
Michelle, since you work with MPAs, but then please feel free, everyone can answer the question.
There are several initiatives.
Oh, I think we lost Susanna for a bit. Maybe Michelle, you want to go first, and when she's back, she can talk.
Sure. Okay, that's unfortunate. Well, I'd start by saying, and this is also related to the next question that I see in the terms of an economic case. The recent initiative to recognize the personhood of whales in the Pacific has an economic component to it. One of the ways that this initiative is being built is to try to bring to light the living value of whales, or to make it so that the ecosystem services, for example, their carbon sequestration power is taken into account in decision making. And there was a recent study showing that just their ecosystem services brought in terms of the great whales could be, measured at approximately 2 million per whale. So if we start to take that into account in decision making, it starts to have a ripple effect. For example, shipping companies and insurance companies, for those shipping companies, taking that into account and requiring, anti-collision devices, things like that, higher premiums. And so that is something that Pacific Whale Fund and Blue Green Future are really coordinating and working on together. I'm not the best one to speak to the economic side because I focus more on the law, but there is some work starting to happen within the space to show the value of nature, while still respecting the core principle of nature having intrinsic value and worthy of protection regardless of that value, but understand we also need to work with the system that we have, and that requires market and economic evaluation.
Thank you, Michelle. I see that Susanna also is back on connection. You can also respond to the question.
Yes. No, I was saying that there are several national and regional initiatives in the Caribbean. For example, in individual country has funds that receive money from, for example, entrance fees to marine protected areas, and these go back to the marine protected areas conservation. And was also speaking about the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, who is helping individual countries to create environmental funds. For example, San Lucia, Cuba. I know there are several other examples, and these funds can also receive money from these activities. I know in particular of the entrance fees of marine protected areas, or for example, the use of marine and coastal ecosystem from hotels and things like that. Not so sure about the fisheries paying, but definitely it's another option that can be explored. Over. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question goes to Craig. It's from an anonymous viewer, so I'll just read it out. Craig, I agree we need to have one monitoring approach as opposed to 108 monitoring approaches. How do you see us addressing the lack of standardized terminology between research projects, regions, and states?
Laura, thank you, and thanks to the person who asked the question. I'd like to answer two questions because I lost signal. I think the ship that I'm on might have turned or so during that question about how you protect the rights of scientists from worst practices. So let me address the question you asked most recently first. I want to credit the IOC and the GOOS community for developing the standards within which oceanographic instrumentation is defined to be the best practice. So it's a combination of what GOOS has done so far, and then also this particular initiative that we're addressing, the Ocean Best Practices Routine, to be able to look at what are the standards that we have to collect for and then comport with those standards in the manufacture or the development of tools that make those measurements and observations. So rather than saying you have to buy, I'll just make up a company name, you have to buy the AAA Access salinometer. No, you just have to procure measurements through a salinometer that meets these quality assurance standards, of which there may be many. You do then invite the need to have a certification regime that proves, rather than the naked assertion of the commercial provider of their device, that it actually does comport with those standards. But I think Goose has done a very good job of allowing flexibility in the tools to be developed as long as they comport with these standards. And as long as it is science refereed, where we have seen I keep going back to Argo because I think Argo is a fine example of many of these attributes, that where data starts to drift because a particular manufacturer started to use a less expensive methodology and introduced by happenstance vulnerabilities to those measurements, the science community will track that and follow it. The person on the assembly line may not. So, okay, bear that in mind. But in terms of getting just one, we have to get past that notion that the researcher has to come up with a neat new term, a neat new label, in order to get their research project funded to have another observation system, instead of having the funding authorities, which are typically governments, accept the value that my government wants to be part of this global community and contribute to the global ocean observation system. And oh, by the way, I don't need a newly named system. I don't need a newly named cute attribute to go along with it. I just need to be part of what the international community has defined as those competent measurements to be made. And this is my financial contribution to it. It's not a research project. It's operational oceanography, just like a weather service is. So I think it's a transition from our science minds. It's a transition to the funding authorities. And it's also a transition of the budgeting to make sure that we get away from having to rely on a cute new research project each time in order to get the funding to do what we've been doing all along, and see it as an operational responsibility. If I can go back to the former question, I did have some experience with this difficulty of protecting scientific integrity during the administration of Donald Trump, which gives me great fear for the possibility of a return of a Trump administration, which carries the baggage of vindictiveness. I think the best way to protect scientists is to pass laws that protect the expression of scientific freedom and penalize anyone who would pervert the scientific conclusion for political gain. And right now, the United States does not have such a law. And if Trump gets elected again, I don't mean to be political in this setting, but there are many Trumps around the world right now, and you could substitute a lot of names for them, as the person who offered this question might infer, that if you don't have a free-speaking democratic society, you shouldn't find your science being told by political values. Your science should be spoken to based on scientific inquiry and the truths that are found. How do you protect the scientists? I hope our listeners live in an environment where you don't suffer social or other retribution for speaking the truth. But until you protect by law, it's going to be very hard to keep people sustained in the openness of free expression. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, and also for raising this very, very important topic. Anyone else wants to add or comment on what Craig said? Otherwise, I'll go on to the next question in the chat box. To Michelle, such impressive work. What are the biggest challenges you face when you speak about the rights of the ocean and marine organisms?
Yeah, so I mean, one, uniform and consistent messaging about what it is and what it means in practice. What it is, I think we're getting there. But what it means in practice, there's still a lot of work to do on getting, these legal and academic interpretations, court cases translated to the public in ways that, everyone can understand. And then second would be political and private interests, of course. I think with any conservation effort, that goes on, that's one of the biggest hurdles, and it's still the case for rights of nature, because there's a fear of, once they hear rights of nature, that automatically means to them, my rights will be affected, my livelihood, or less profit. So that kind of also goes back to messaging, is making that messaging clear that that's not necessarily the case. Just because you pass the rights of nature law does not mean nature is intangible, or untouchable. It just means that now you have to balance more interests and values in those decision-making processes.
Yeah, I think that directly goes to the next question. That's why I will ask it right away. Are there any ideas or projects on how best to bring in the idea of ocean rights into the operationalization of the BBNJ as an example of international treaties?
Yeah, so we tried this and didn't get the full vision that we wanted, but there is an essence of ocean rights underpinning principles in the treaty, in the preamble, where it states that it desires for states to act as stewards of the ocean and areas beyond national jurisdiction on behalf of present and future generations by protecting, caring for, and ensuring responsible use of the marine environment, maintaining the integrity of ocean ecosystems, and my favorite part, conserving the inherent value of biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So, as we know, preambular text is to inform the interpretation and the implementation of a treaty, even if it's not in the operative text. So, for example, I could see, and something that I'm building sort of more understanding for, is how it then, the intrinsic value, the inherent value of biological diversity will need to be taken into account, for example, in EIAs. Right now, that's a missing piece. That's an externality that's not included. So I think there's ways that, even though it's in the preamble, that underpinning principles of rights of nature, ocean rights, can inform the implementation of this treaty. It's just about kind of working through those different ways.
Yeah, definitely. Someone else wants to comment on this as well? Yes.
I just wanted to highlight on the relevance of leverage the existing frameworks to work on the BBNJ. The BBNJ is creating a whole new framework, but we already have regional and global frameworks. So it's very relevant to cooperate between these new and the existing ones to promote the work on the ABNJ. Thank you.
Definitely, good point. We have 3 minutes left, so I'll ask another question and then we see how we go. How does our experience with the All Atlantic efforts teach us about one global ocean system? Maybe Venkat or Craig, you can respond to this.
I've been doing a lot of talking. I'll let Venkat go first if he would care to.
I can talk more about Indian Ocean. We have a good observing network in the Indian Ocean. I'm glad to say that Craig is here. India and USA jointly deployed common observing systems. We have Omni Network and Rama Network, and we have a joint portal and where the data sharing take place. I had an opportunity to visit PMEL and NOAA PMEL, and I'm very glad to say that they are collaborating with 10 countries. That's one of the largest ever international collaboration for real-time data collection. So that model is one of the successful model. I can proudly say that that has been working out. Why this portal has come out is that there is a commonality in the data collection method. There is an interaction among ourselves, and we have a best method by which the data quality is controlled and checked. So this is a classic example for having a system deployed and shared with the society. Great, maybe you can add.
Venkat, thank you very much. And let me just really re-endorse and further endorse what Venkat has talked about. Two countries got together United States and India. And we decided that we were going to start an appropriate monitoring of the Indian Ocean, recognizing the importance of those measurements. And then other countries joined along. And we've not done that yet in the Atlantic. We still don't have an all-Atlantic Ocean observing system. It's an objective of the All-Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance. And I was very proud to be part of the team that put that together, particularly under the leadership of John Bell in the European Union. We still don't have it. We have Atlantos, which was a well-funded planning process. So we have a nice planning document, but we really haven't done anything to start getting the equipment wet and deployed. By comparison, what we did in the Pacific and what we did in the Indian Ocean is we had scientific vision, but we also had financial planning going on at the same time. And Venkat and his colleagues in India were generating the budgets necessary as we did the same thing. So it's not just the science vision that you need to come up with. You have to have a science vision, and you have to have a programmatic funding financial vision for where and how you're going to generate these funds. You put the two together and you have a success. If you don't, and you just go with the scientific vision, you have an aspiration that will largely remain unfulfilled.
Yeah, thank you.
I can add to that another interesting project in Bay of Bengal in India and US joined together, and 3 times American ship came here. The best part of this is that it's not the research alone, the capacity building part, where there are scientific tools and instruments have been brought in that students from both the countries have jointly said, not only India, many other countries have come together. We learned a lot and shared it. So long-term expertise has been built in. That is what is currently needed because ocean is so dynamic. It's impossible for one country to invest and proceed, and the sensors are expensive. So if countries can come together and use this model and collect the data and share, that would be a great help to the mankind.
Yeah, thank you very much. On this point, I'm really sorry, but we have to wrap up this session. I know we could keep on discussing for much longer. So I would encourage all of you to just reach out to us if you want to keep this discussion going, as this is a very, very pressing issue. And I'm thankful for all of our speakers today to share your insights and your valuable expertise. It's much appreciated. And I look forward to staying in touch and keep this discussion going. So thank you to the speakers and to all the participants for joining today.
We get a screenshot of everybody turning on their cameras for the last minute.
Sure.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Ooh, I should turn on mine. Let me turn on mine. Sorry about that.
Well,
Very good, Jay.
recording, will we get a link to be able to share after the fact, or will it be private?
It is on YouTube. It's live streamed, so you can just also I can send them the YouTube live stream link again. Yeah.
Perfect.
That's good because many people will see me ticking off some of the people I wanted to tick off in this comment.
I loved it.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a really great pleasure.
This is a great team. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Take care,
Thank you all.
folks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.